Orders of the day.
Order of the day number 1, Gaming Control Amendment, Future Gaming Market Bill 2021, number 45, resumption of adjourned debate. Dr Seidel on the question that the bill be now read the second time.
The honourable member for Hewitt.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I'd like to begin by thanking the Honourable Leader of the Government for facilitating the briefings on this bill and actually for allowing sufficient time for asking questions. I note the compromise the Leader had to make for allowing the briefings to be recorded for later viewing if needed. That's indeed very helpful and I actually very much appreciate it. Mr. President, it's not clear who said laws are like sausages. It's better not to see them being made. But clearly, the Gaming Control Amendment Bill is a prime case in point. This was meant to be the cornerstone of the Liberal government's reform agenda. At least that's what the public has been told for years. But what we got is an amendment bill of over 240 pages that aims to amend a principal act with over 180 clauses. The bill has been described as complex, and that in itself is not necessarily bad. However, it is also incohesive and, despite its volume, anything but comprehensive. If that's the best a government can come up with at its perceived peak, one really has to wonder what kind of bill will reach this chamber in a couple of years. And as the member for Hobart mentioned yesterday, even the Solicitor General can't make sense of the government's legislation now, which is quite extraordinary.
One piece of it.
Yeah, not this one in particular.
Still quite extraordinary, to do this publicly. But that's exactly what happens when the government spends more time and resources on its media unit than on a policy team. Legislation must have substance. Legislation must be clear and concise. And legislation must have a genuine purpose. This bill, however, as we heard in the briefings, is an Omnibus Amendment Act and it's actually been described as being disrespectful to Parliament. We heard in the briefing that we received that it would be entirely possible to have a bill of just 50 pages long informing a strong regulatory framework. We also heard from the department that a principles-based overarching framework and 2 separate acts would have reflected what the government actually promised to deliver: meaningful reform. We were told that this could have been achieved with existing resources over 4 to 5 years. Even sooner, if a commitment for better resources would have been given at the time. However, this government proposed a joint select committee on future gaming markets in 2016 instead, and, wait for it, rejected the recommendations of the committee. What was the point, I wonder, of proposing the select committee in the first place? And I did sense the genuine disappointment when the member for Mersey made his contribution on this bill yesterday, as he was the chair of the select committee at the time. That report is essential reading for all members of Parliament, and I do like to thank the member for Mersey for his outstanding work, and also for the contribution the member for Murchison made in that committee. McIntyre, I'm sorry, in that committee. Yesterday, we also heard from the member for Mersey that the THA Federal Group presented a model on the final day of the committee hearings. And we heard evidence from the former Tasmanian Gaming Commissioner Peter Holt that the current bill before us represents, and I quote, the exact model favoured by industry. I read the Hansard of the debate in the other place carefully to better understand the rationale for this bill. And if I had done a thematic analysis and the follow-up in the media, then one theme would have stood out. Smashing the federal monopoly. The exact phrase was repeated multiple times. Smashing the federal monopoly. Yet when I look at the objects of the Act, Clause 33, page 45, the government's media-crafted objective does not feature. The clause does read, though, 2A, object of Act. The object of this Act is to provide for the licensing, supervision and control of gambling in Tasmania. In particular to A, ensure that gambling is conducted in a fair, honest and transparent way and is free from criminal influence. And B, protect people, particularly people who are vulnerable, from being harmed by gambling or exploited by gaming operators. C, ensure that returns from gambling are shared appropriately, including by being invested in services that support those harmed by or at risk of harm from gambling amongst the gaming industry, consumers in the state. And that's where the problem is with this bill, because the bill over 244 pages does not address its own object. It doesn't ensure that gambling is conducted in a fair, honest and transparent way. It does not protect vulnerable people from being harmed by gambling. And it does not ensure, as the member for Murchison pointed out, that the returns from gambling are shared appropriately. However, this bill does legislate new forms of gambling, transitions a monopoly to a cartel, and introduces a new definition of what it means to be a Tasmanian resident. And we here in this chamber are now meant to be going through this bill clause by clause with a fine comb because the government has not done the work of the last 5 years. They just passed it in the lower house because, yes, they have the numbers there. It is a mess. It's not actually a complex bill. No, this bill is not fit for purpose. And if we pass this bill in the current form, not only the Solicitor General wonder what the point of Parliament actually is. This is not going to be easy. If the government wants to enact cohesive legislation that meets its own status objective, then further systematic inquiry or specific detailed amendments will be required. And I trust the government wants to do the right thing here. After all, the legislation is meant to be a cornerstone of this government's ambitious reform agenda. Please give it the attention it deserves. In his speech yesterday, the Honourable Member for Hobart reminded me that we in this House can only deal with the legislation put before us. But I'd like to put on the record my personal view on gaming control. I've played pokies once, and I lost $10, and I promised myself never to lose that much money so quickly or anything ever again.
Doesn't take long.
That's right. But it's my view, though, that recreational gaming, including pokies, should be legal, but appropriately regulated. I'm actually very much agnostic regarding an individual licensing model. I intend to be supportive of any model that ensures an appropriate return from recreational gambling to the Tasmanian community and the state. Best practice in that regard, may change over time. However, what should not change is legislative certainty of an appropriate return. This is not really about modeling here. This is about calibration towards optimal community and state benefit. And this is in fact no different to all other recreational products or services that are potentially harmful or addictive, yet legal. Nicotine and alcohol come to mind. And we've come a long way from the height of recreational use of nicotine, for example. Only decades ago, nicotine was praised for its medicinal purposes. Its recreational use was even encouraged. Turns out, nicotine is addictive and can do harm. Based on rigorous study and informed by scientific evidence, appropriate harm reduction methods have been introduced, all the while the recreational use of some, not all, tobacco products remained legal here in Australia. And I talked about product safety and consumer protection and tobacco use when we debated the T21 bill as introduced by the former member for Windermere. Cigarettes and other tobacco products are available for recreational use. They are subject to very tight product specifications, as I outlined in my speech then. But the use is also restricted in certain areas. One can't smoke in pubs or clubs, for example, and honourable members may recall the public and vocal discussion of potential implications for the hospitality industry in 2005 and 2006. Then the government followed a best practice harm minimisation approach, regardless of the outrage at the time. And see what happened.
Through you, Mr.
Nothing.
President. Sorry to interrupt you. I have to tell you, at that time, it was the best harm minimisation for pokies as well. The losses dropped dramatically for a brief period, interestingly enough.
So again, see what happened. Nothing. No Armageddon, no mass sackings of staff, no bankruptcy, no venue closures. But we've actually reduced the incidence of lung cancer and emphysema. The only professional group affected by legislating, regulating, and implementing measures to protect vulnerable people from the harm of tobacco use were, wait for it, lung cancer specialists and chest physicians. Workforce modelling just suggests we need less of them. We need less of them. Yet I don't hear the AMA agitating that we need to make smoking more accessible again. A focus on product safety is universally accepted in other areas. The car industry is given little options but to continually improve the product safety of their cars. If a manufacturer's latest car does not meet the required and current safety standards, well, that car can't be sold in Australia. It can't be driven in Tasmania. Members of Parliament are only entitled to a vehicle with a 5-star NCAP rating. Members are not entitled to anything that does not meet the gold standard in safety. It's almost as if the Treasury wants to protect members of Parliament from harm.
I think sometimes I probably wonder about that.
Well, you are not entitled to a car that doesn't meet the gold standard for safety. There's no choice for you. So going back to the object of the Act, Clause 33, 2AB, is quite explicit. The object of this Act is to protect people, particularly people who are vulnerable from being harmed by gambling. It's explicit. Yet I'm confused by this. I'm confused because Professor Charles Livingston, who gave evidence yesterday, stated this bill is characterised by woeful omission of harm minimisation. I have no reason to believe that Professor Livingston was intending to mislead members of this House with his statement. He did not have parliamentary privilege when he made this statement. I have reason to believe that Professor Livingston was indeed stating a fact. So what are we doing now? So we either amend the object of the Act, because it's really quite confusing to pretend the legislation is stating something that in fact it does not cover after all. Or we introduce and enshrine sound, meaningful, scientifically appraised, accepted and evidence-based harm minimization in this legislation. Mr. President, protecting people from being harmed by gambling is the object of this Act. And protecting them, we must. Anglicare CEO, the Right Reverend Dr. Chris Jones, stated yesterday that his and other organizations care for over 2,000 Tasmanians who suffer from gambling addiction. He stated, the current bill will do nothing to improve that. Nothing. And Mr. President, that's not a prophecy. That's the hard reality of Tasmania in 2021. But it's of course not too late. We are here in this chamber to amend sloppy legislation all the time. They're all government bills, all part of the government's agenda, or indeed the government's mandate to put it on the agenda. We are here to improve legislation. And it is indeed amazing what can be achieved if one does not have to take credit for it. So I'm urging the government to consider the next steps forward. Is the government willing to consider further amendments that strengthen the legislation when it comes to protecting people from being harmed by gambling? If the answer is yes, let's get right into it. If the answer is no, is the government willing to consider referring the bill to our parliamentary inquiry for further review and report as suggested by the member for Mersey? There's no rush. And I thank the Honourable Leader of the Government for agreeing to adjourn the debate on this bill after the summing up of members' second reading speeches. There will be time for reflection, consideration and review over the weekend before we come back to the debate next week. Thank you.